I'm Amy the Amazonian, and in this video I'll be showing off 30 brand new digital-only cards coming to Magic the Gathering Arena in Alchemy Bloomburrow. These cards will be available on August 20th and playable in Alchemy, Historic, Timeless, and Brawl. The first of these cards is Brave Meadow Guard, a 2-mana 1/1 mouse soldier that's part of the Valiant archetype. Whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time in a turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, which rewards you for playing the spell it conjures, which is Might of the Meek. Because this enters and generates a spell, it's a great way to curve out when you're playing a Boros mice deck, getting a way to trigger Valiant on either Brave Meadow Guard or any of the other Valiant creatures in your deck. Recruit Instructor is a Boros mouse warrior that rewards you for attacking with mice, including itself. Whenever you attack with a mouse, you get a spell from its spellbook into hand, and whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time its turn, you trigger its Valiant ability, which is creating another mouse. And all of the spells from its spellbook are targeting spells or permanents that have a targeting ability. You have Angel Fire Ignition, Barge In, Become Brutes, Boon of Safety, Cheeky House Mouse, Crumb and Get It, Defiant Strike, Embercleave, Feather of Flight, and Mabel's Metal, and Might of the Meek, and Moment of Heroism, and Unleash Fury, and finally, War Squeak. Yes, that's a lot of very aggressive spells, some of which are instant speed and some of which are sorcery speed, meaning that you may want to trigger Valiant before you go into combat just to see what other kind of tricks you might pull out of the spellbook. 3-Tree Battalion is a callback to Collected Company. This 4-mana instant looks at the top 6 cards of your libraries and allows you to put a creature card with a mana value 3 or less from among them into the battlefield. Then, you conjure a duplicate of that card into the battlefield, but the duplicate perpetually becomes a 1/1. This means that you are getting to pick between 6 different cards, choosing the one that is most appropriate for the situation, and making 2 of them enter play. This gets especially good if you have typal synergy between your cards that care about how many of them are in play, or if it's just whatever best card you happen to see in those 6 cards. Because this is at instant speed, you can also wait until your opponent's end step or when they declare attackers to try to find the perfect blockers or get around counter spells or force your opponent to tap out of mana on their turn. Cottontail Caretaker knows that good things come in pairs. This 2-mana 2/2 Rabbit Citizen enters and then gives a white creature in your hand Offspring 1, meaning that when you cast that card, you can play an additional 1 mana to make a second copy of it, though that other copy is going to be a 1/1 creature token. This is a great way to duplicate strong creatures with excellent abilities, though maybe not the best stats, for just 1 mana. Buxton, Decorated Host, is our first legendary creature of the set. This Rabbit Noble has Convoke, meaning you can pay for some of its mana cost by tapping creatures in addition to paying mana. It's a 4/4, but it gets you value during each of your end steps if you have tapped creatures, which means that you can play it with other Convoke spells or just attack your opponents in order to get a permanent into play. At the beginning of your end step, if you control a tapped creature, you seek a non-land permanent card with a mana value X or less, where X is the number of tapped creatures you control. This card goes directly onto the battlefield, meaning that if you have 5 different creatures tapped, you have a chance of getting anything from between 0 and 5 mana directly from your deck into play. This is a fantastic repeatable source of Selesnya value, and it rewards you greatly for attacking your opponent or using Convoke. Non-creature spells beware. Ramble Armor Brawler is a raccoon that's ready for action. This is a 4-mana 5/5 raccoon warrior that cannot be countered. It also has Trample and buffs all of the creatures in your library whenever your opponents cast non-creature spells, meaning that if you can get your Ramble Armor Brawler to stay in play, the creatures in your library will grow and grow and grow as your opponents cast more spells. Resourceful Collector knows how to find food in unusual places. This 3-mana 3/3 Raccoon Druid with haste isn't just good with other raccoons and other cruel aggressive creatures, it also gives you graveyard recursion. And it isn't picky. At the beginning of your end step, a random non-food permanent card in your graveyard perpetually becomes a food. You can play that card for as long as it remains in your graveyard, and if it is in play, you can pay 2 mana and exile the artifact to gain 3 life, truly embodying the raccoon philosophy of live fast and eat trash. Charged Conjuration sets you up for a storm. This 4-mana enchantment makes it so at the beginning of your upkeep, instants and sorcery cards in your hand perpetually gain this spell costs 1 less to cast. You can also sacrifice this enchantment to conjure a card from its spellbook. This is a sorcery speed ability, but it guarantees you getting a storm card. The 3 cards you have a choice between are Empty the Warrens, which generates goblins, Galvanic Relay, which gets you card advantage next turn in exile, and Grape Shot, which deals damage to any target. Indris, the Hydrostatic Surge, is a spellslinger's dream. This legendary otter incarnation enters play and creates a copy of Lightning Bolt into your library. But it's not just any Lightning Bolt, because it perpetually gains Storm, meaning when you cast it, it gets copied for each other spell that was cast in a turn. And Indris even gives you a way to find that Lightning Bolt, because whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card, giving you lots of spells you can cast to build up your Storm count and deal a lot of damage off of Lightning Bolt. You can also use spells like Solve the Equation to search your library for Lightning Bolt, so you can grab it directly into your hand and start doing some spell damage. Tempest Trapper is an otter wizard that rewards you for casting spells and helps you cast instants and sorceries. This 4-mana 2/5 can tap to add 2 mana in any combination of colors, but only to cast instants and sorceries. And whenever you cast your 3rd spell each turn, you exile a random non-land card from your library, and until end of turn, you can play or cast that spell for free. Because the card you're casting for free is random, it's going to be difficult to set up anything that's particularly expectable, but you can always expect the unexpected when it comes to casting lots of spells in a turn. Chittering Skullspeaker is a 2-mana squirrel warlock that draws you a card and loses a life when it enters play. And then if another Chittering Skullspeaker does the same, it will draw you 2 cards and lose you 2 life. Or, a 3rd time, 3 cards and 3 life. This effect applies on reanimation, blink, or the creature just entering the battlefield after being cast, but you have to make sure you have the life to lose when a Chittering Skullspeaker enters play. Chittering Skullspeaker pairs nicely with sacrifice and squirrel cards like Chatterfang Squirrel General, and also cards like Luris that would allow you to recast this card from graveyard if it happens to be there, increasing its intensity and getting you even more cards. Speaking of sacrifice, Tasteful Offering is a sorcery speed spell that gives you a boon where whenever you sacrifice 1 or more permanents, you seek a non-land card. It also gives you a food token which you can then sacrifice. This sets you up nicely to forage, but it also rewards you for sacrificing any other permanent for any effect, even abilities from the sacrifice of fetch lands or from treasure tokens. The final legendary creature of Bloomburrow Alchemy is Uru, Acorn Sker. This is a 4-mana 3/3 squirrel soldier. When it enters, you may forage, meaning you may sacrifice a food or exile 3 cards from your graveyard. And when you do, conjure a card named Chitterspitter into play. Chitterspitter is an artifact that allows you to make squirrel tokens or buff all your squirrels by accumulating acorn counters. You can use that using the Chitterspitter itself or Uru's other ability. Whenever 1 or more squirrels you control deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice a token. If you do, put an acorn counter onto each permanent you control named Chitterspitter. And yes, you can accumulate as many Chitterspitters as you like, as long as Uru enters the battlefield multiple times. Vigorous farming is an interesting new take on Ramp. This 3-mana enchantment makes it so your lands enter the battlefield untapped, and it also makes your lands in your library tap for more mana. At the beginning of your end step, the topmost land in your library gains. Whenever this land is tapped for mana, add an additional green mana, meaning the longer it stays in your deck, the more mana it taps for. This plays especially nicely with Bloomburrow's own Clifftop Lookout. That creature gets you the land that's on the top of your deck and puts it into play. That means that no matter what, you'll be getting whichever card has been buffed by your vigorous farming, and it will even come into play untapped. This next card is a Calamity Beast, the Putrifying Boar, a 4-mana 4/5 with lifelink that rewards you for attacking with boars, such as itself. Whenever a boar you control attacks, each non-land card in your opponent's hand perpetually gains. Whenever you cast this spell, you lose 1 life. This plays nicely not just with itself, but with other boar cards, including the 3 little pigs and the cards that are generated by Drover of the Swine. Thought Rattle attacks your opponent's hand directly. This 2-mana sorcery makes your opponent reveal each non-land card in their hand. You can then choose one of those cards and exile it. If you happen to have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you also seek a rat from your deck. and that rat card then costs 1 less mana. This is very nice if you happen to have a couple rats like Wren the Relentless or Wick the Morald Mind in your library, or even on its own. This is a nice way to slow your opponents down while you set up your own game plan. Dazzling Flameweaver is a 4-mana 4/4 Lizard Warlock. It has menace and a ward cost of making your opponent pay 3 life. And whenever one or more of the creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, you conjure a random card from the Dazzling Spellweaver's spellbook into exile. You may only cast that spell this turn, but like this lizard, Dazzling Flameweaver's spellbook is full of spectacle cards, which means that they will cost less since you've dealt damage to your opponent on this turn. The cards on the spellbook are Blade Juggler, Body Count, Dead Revels, Drill Bit, Acrobat, Light Up the Stage, Rafter Demon, Rixmati Reveler, Skewer the Critics, Spawn Mayhem, and Spike Wheel Acrobat. Marshland Hordemaster wants you to go wide with lizards. This 3-mana Lizard Warlock gains Battlecry when it or another lizard you control enters play. And because Battlecry stacks, the more lizards you've had enter after the Marshland Hordemaster, the more damage each of those lizards will be doing when the Marshland Hordemaster attacks. And whenever it or another lizard you control dies, target opponent loses 1 life, which is a great enabler for the your opponent lost a life mechanic that was common in the Bloomburrow lizards. Sandcloud Harbinger ties nicely into Thunder Junction. This elemental horse is a calamity beast on Bloomburrow, and it's a 2/4 that generates deserts into both players' decks. Whenever this enters, you conjure 3 Sunscorched Deserts into the top 10 cards of each player's library in random positions. And whenever a player plays a desert, that player draws a card, but you gain 3 life. This is especially good if you are playing a deck with other deserts in it, or some of the other cards from Thunder Junction that can find deserts for you and put them into play. Awestruck Signet is no ugly duckling. This 1-mana 2/1 Bird Scout is aggressive on its own, but the more creatures you have with flying, the bigger your signets will get. It starts with an intensity of 0, but whenever a creature you control with flying enters, if this creature is still Awestruck Signet, its intensity increases, as does the intensity of all other Awestruck Signets in your deck, and in your hand, and in play. And as long as this card's intensity is 3 or more, it's no longer a 2/1, it is a 5/4 with flying and vigilance, who goes by the name Radiant Swan. The more flying creatures you have in your deck, the better the Awestruck Signet gets, and if you manage to turn one of them into Radiant Swan, all of them become Radiant Swan, and for just 1 mana, a 5/4 flying vigilance creature is no joke. Ace Flockbringer believes that every creature deserves to have flying. This is a 3-mana 3/3 Bird Scout with flying, and whenever you cast a creature spell without flying, you conjure a duplicate of it into your hand. The duplicate gains flying. This ability only triggers once each turn, but it gives you duplicates of each creature that you cast, meaning that the Ace Flockbringer helps you go wide with Azorius aggro, and gives half of your creatures extra evasion through flying. This card doesn't play that well with other flyers since it won't make duplicates of them, but any other cards that you want to have more of will be beneficial to you when you have a Flockbringer in play. Shelfish Scholar is a 3-mana 3/2 rat wizard, and he isn't very selfish because he shares his thoughts with every other rat that enters play. Whenever the Shelfish Scholar or another rat you control enters, conjure a card named Think Twice into your graveyard. And if you have Threshold, meaning you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you can tap the Scholar to make it so the spells you cast from your graveyard cost 2 less this turn, including the copies of Think Twice which have been added to the grave. This helps you hit Threshold by generating copies of cards, and then it gives you discounts. I feel it's good with cards that also have flashback, like the one it's generating, or cards that allow you to cast spells from graveyard, like Muldrotha. Pool Resources is a 3-mana instant that gives you the option of gifting your opponent a fish. If you don't give your opponent a fish, you draw 2 cards, but if you're willing to give your opponent a tapped fish token, then you can seek 2 non-land cards instead. This is a nice way to guarantee getting spells later in the game when you know you don't need any more mana. Archival Whirl is a 5-mana sorcery Time Twister effect, and it gives you the choice of promising a gift of a Rhystic Study to your opponent when you cast this spell. Shuffle your hand in your graveyard into your library, and then draw 7 cards. If the gift was not promised, each other player also shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7 cards. But if you've given your opponent a Rhystic Study, then they'll keep the same exact cards in their hand. But they will be getting an incredibly powerful enchantment that makes it so whenever you cast a spell, your opponent will be drawing a card unless you can pay 1 mana. Eventually, they may end up drawing more cards, but at the time that the Rhystic Study enters play, you'll have a full hand of 7 brand new cards, and your opponent will just have an enchantment. A card like Archival Whirl also pairs nicely with cards like Narset Carter of Veils that deny your opponent the ability to draw additional cards in a turn. Darkstar Banisher is a 3-mana 2/2 Bat Cleric. This creature has flying, and when it enters, you exile target non-land permanent with a mana value 3 or less than an opponent controls, including a token. This means that the card is exiled for good, but when Darkstar Banisher leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner will seek a card that shares a card type with the exiled card, meaning that if you exiled an enchantment, they'll get a random enchantment from their deck. If you exiled a creature, they will get a random creature from their deck. And if you exiled a token, they will get nothing because there's no card still underneath the Darkstar Banisher. It's also worth noting that similar to Skyclave Apparition, if this card is killed or bounced in response to its entering ability, the creature will not seek a card. Sanguine Soothsayer is a 2-mana 2/1 flying lifelink Bat Cleric. This bat, whenever it attacks, conjures a copy of Sanguine Bond into the top 15 cards of your library in a random position. That card perpetually gains the ability to be cast for 0 mana, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. This means that you are getting free copies of a card that is fantastic with the Orzhov Bats archetype from Bloomburrow. Whenever you gain life, target opponent will lose that much life whenever you have a Sanguine Bond in play. And because Sanguine Soothsayer can attack multiple times and generate multiple copies of Sanguine Bond, you have the potential to generate a whole bunch of Sanguine Bonds that you can then cast for free. This is fantastic with all of the other bats or just on its own since it does have lifelink. It's worth noting that in Historic, Timeless, and Brawl, you can also add the card Exquisite Blood into your deck, which makes for an infinite combo between those Sanguine Bonds in itself whenever you've either gained life or your opponent has lost life in a turn. Traverse Valley is a 1-mana sorcery that seeks a random non-basic land card from your deck and puts it into your hand. But if you pay its kicker cost when you cast it, which is foraging, either sacrificing a food or exiling 3 cards from your graveyard, that land actually comes into play tapped. This is an interesting 1-mana ramp spell that won't be able to ramp on your first turn, but it does play nicely with other cards that care about both the graveyard and lands, like Necrobloom, or if you have anything else that allows you to fill up your graveyard early in the game or make food tokens. CoSmite is a 1-mana sorcery that can deal 2 damage to target creature, and then you create a treasure token if you weren't the starting player. This is a great way to respond to your opponent's early game creatures, taking them out and giving you a little bit of ramp if you happen to go second. In a format like Alchemy, this is the perfect piece of removal to take out a Slickshot show-off, but if you're playing a format like Brawl or Timeless, this can take out your opponent's Ragavans, their Delighted Halflings, or their Birds of Paradise. Leaf Leap Guide is hopping with value. This 2-mana creature doesn't stay a 1/1 for long, because whenever a creature you control enters, it perpetually gains +1/+1, and gives the other entering creature a perpetual +1/+1 buff as well. That means that that buff stays on each creature, even if they get returned into your hand, which works well with Leaf Leap Guide's other ability, which allows you to pay 1 mana and tap it to return another creature you control into its owner's hand. This is a great way to just continuously grow your creatures, or repeat enter the battlefield abilities off of cards like Frilled Mystic or Aether Channeler, or even larger creatures like Torrential Gearhulk. And the final card in Bloomburrow Alchemy is the Fountainport Charmer. This 3-mana 1/1 frog bard enters and then discounts all of the creatures in your hand, making it even easier to have a bounce party with all of your frogs. I hope you enjoyed getting this first look at Bloomburrow Alchemy and seeing all of the new cards that are coming to Arena. Once again, I'm Amy the Amazonian, and if you'd like to find my content, I'm over at twitch.tv/Amazonian and youtube.com/Amazonian. I hope that you'll stop on by and come play some Brawl with me and the new Alchemy cards.